She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was just a woman who wanted to be loved and ended up marrying power instead. When they found Layla Al-Hassan's body in a quiet Texas Airbnb, the story made no sense. A Dubai millionaire's wife, thousands of miles from home. No forced entry, no sign of struggle. Just two people dead. And a phone that wouldn't stop syncing. At first, it looked like another tragedy the world would scroll past. But inside that phone were recordings, hours of them, that told a story no one was supposed to hear. A story about control disguised as love. About money that could buy silence, but not innocence. And about a woman who refused to disappear quietly. Welcome back to True Crime Retold, where we uncover cases that test everything you think you know about human nature. If you find our deep dives as gripping as we do, please take a second to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new case. Now, let's get into it. Everyone said it was the wedding of the year. No one asked the bride if she wanted it. Layla Al-Hassan was born into comfort, the kind that hides its cost. Her father ran one of Dubai's largest construction firms, the kind tied to power and politics. Her mother lived for reputation, charity galas, invitations, quiet competition. Layla was the only daughter, raised to be polished, well-spoken, and useful. In their world, love wasn't a decision, it was a distraction, and distractions were dangerous. From a distance, Layla's life looked perfect. She studied at private schools, spoke 3 languages, traveled for summer programs. But every choice, what to wear, who to see, how to speak, was already decided before she opened her mouth. Still, she'd found a small piece of freedom in the unlikeliest place, a young man named Omar. He wasn't rich or connected. He was a teacher at a local arts center who loved music more than money. With him, she laughed differently, louder, unguarded. For the first time, she felt seen instead of displayed. She hid that relationship for a year. They met in parking lots, sent voice notes instead of texts, used fake names when calling each other. But secrets never last in families built on reputation. When Kareem Hassan appeared, the game changed. He was older, polished, charming, and powerful enough to make anything happen. He had followed Layla for years, always lingering at family functions, sending gifts her parents called respectful. They didn't see obsession. They saw opportunity. One evening, Kareem visited Layla's father's office under the pretense of business. The meeting lasted an hour. By the time it ended, her life had already been rewritten. Her father told her at dinner that night. His tone was gentle, like he was announcing good news. Kareem Hassan has asked for your hand. It's an honorable offer. His family is prepared to invest in ours. Layla's fork froze in her hand. She tried to speak, but her mother touched her arm. Say thank you, Habibti. That was the moment she realized her voice had no weight in her own story. She tried to resist quietly at first. She told them she loved someone else, that she wasn't ready, that marriage should be her decision. Her mother called it childish. Her father said, "We don't marry for love, we marry for stability." Kareem, on the other hand, was patient. He sent her flowers every day for a month. Roses, orchids, lilies, everything beautiful, everything suffocating. He'd say, "You'll never have to struggle again." But his promises felt like bars on a cage. When he found out about Omar, the mask slipped. Within weeks, Omar lost his teaching position. His visa renewal was suddenly denied. Layla knew exactly who was behind it. Kareem never mentioned Omar again. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Everyone she cared for could vanish. From then on, she smiled when spoken to and stopped saying no. She rehearsed her engagement interview answers, smiled for photographers, and nodded through conversations that had nothing to do with her. Inside, she counted days the way prisoners count cracks in a wall. People called Kareem generous. He donated to orphanages, sponsored university students, shook hands with ministers. On camera, he was perfect. Off camera, his kindness carried weight. Compliments always came with expectation. Questions were met with quiet reprimands. Sometimes Layla would imagine what life could have been if she'd been born ordinary. Maybe she'd still be teaching. Maybe she'd still laugh at small things instead of analyzing every word before she spoke. But that dream ended the day Kareem came to their home to make it official. He arrived with gifts for the family, watches, perfumes, gold pens, and a diamond ring for her. He slid it onto her finger and said, "Now, no one can take you from me." It sounded romantic, but his eyes didn't match his smile. The engagement announcement spread quickly. Magazines called it a power union. Her parents received congratulations from officials and old friends. People said she was lucky, blessed, chosen. Only she knew she was trapped. The night before the wedding, she sat alone on her balcony, staring at the city lights. She tried to picture happiness, but it felt like trying to breathe underwater. She whispered to herself, "Maybe it won't be so bad." The silence answered her back. The wedding day came like a performance. Cameras, flowers, gold everywhere. Her mother cried with pride. Her father shook Kareem's hand like sealing a deal. Layla's face appeared on every local magazine cover that week. Everyone admired the couple's elegance, their storybook romance. No one noticed that she never looked directly at him in the photos. She remembered fragments of the day. The smell of jasmine. The weight of the veil, the priest's voice echoing through the hall. When she said, "I do," her throat felt dry. Later that night, when the guests were gone and the laughter faded, she stood in front of a mirror in the hotel suite. The makeup was still perfect, the jewelry still heavy. Her hands trembled when she tried to remove her earrings. She stared at her reflection for a long time, searching for the version of herself that used to exist. It wasn't there anymore. She thought about Omar, where he was, if he was safe. She thought about her father, already asleep in the comfort of a new alliance. And she thought about Kareem, the man she had just promised her life to, though he'd taken it long before tonight. When he entered the room, his footsteps were soft, deliberate. He set a glass of champagne beside her and smiled in the mirror. "You look beautiful," he said. She didn't reply. He raised the glass to her reflection. "To forever." She whispered, almost to herself. Forever sounds like a sentence. He didn't hear her, or pretended not to. That night he talked about their future, about travel, children, family reputation. She nodded where she was supposed to. Inside, her thoughts drifted somewhere far away, to a life she'd never have. She wanted to scream, but she'd been taught since childhood that quiet women are respected. So she stayed quiet. The air felt heavy, perfumed, and stale. The walls looked softer than they should, like they were closing in. Somewhere outside, the city pulsed with life, cars, music, people making their own choices. Inside, Layla sat still, learning what surrender felt like. In the darkness, she whispered one truth that had no audience but herself. You'd think wealth buys choice. It doesn't. The words hung in the air for a moment, fragile and final. Kareem reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You'll get used to this life," he said softly. She smiled the way she'd been trained to. That night, I became his wife, but never his equal. Marriage didn't change much for Layla Al-Hassan. It only made the rules official. The mansion was breathtaking, 3 floors of glass, marble, and silence. But no one told her that silence could echo louder than screams. Every wall was clean, every rug perfect, and every door opened only when someone else decided it should. Each morning began the same way. A soft knock at 6. A maid walking in quietly with a silver tray. Fruit she didn't ask for, tea she didn't like. Followed by the phone, always placed face down beside her breakfast, as if waiting for permission. Kareem didn't like surprises. He said it with a smile that sounded kind until you realized it meant obedience. He wanted every detail of her day planned, who she saw, what she wore, what she said at lunch. Layla stopped asking questions after the 3rd time she was told, It's for your own safety." It was strange how control could disguise itself as care. To outsiders, her life looked like perfection: charity galas, magazine covers, expensive laughter. But inside those gates, she had no voice. When she spoke, people listened with caution, as if afraid her words might be recorded. Even the servants avoided eye contact. Every smile around her was rehearsed. Every step she took was observed. Once during dinner, she mentioned wanting to visit her parents. Karim didn't even look up from his meal. He simply said, "You are home." That was the moment she realized she wasn't a wife. She was property. At first, she tried to earn peace. She complimented him, stayed silent during his moods, smiled when she wanted to cry. She convinced herself that submission might buy freedom. But submission only taught him new ways to test her. He'd ask questions that weren't questions at all. "Who called you today? Why did you take that photo? Do you miss your old life?" He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His silence did the damage for him. When she hesitated, even for a heartbeat, he'd set his glass down and stare at her until she apologized. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. If she answered wrong, he'd punish the people around her instead. A driver sent away, a maid fired, her best friend's number mysteriously blocked. That was his favorite trick, making her feel guilty for things she didn't do. Her parents didn't help. They called her often, but never listened. When she told her mother she felt trapped, her mother sighed softly and said, "He's a powerful man, Layla. You must be patient. Time makes men gentler." But time didn't make him gentle. It made her quiet. Months passed. Karim's absences grew longer. He traveled often: London, New York, Paris, always for business. Each time he left, the house exhaled, as if even the walls could breathe without him. Layla would walk barefoot through empty rooms just to feel movement again. For a few hours, she'd almost believe she was free. Then the phone would ring. His voice would fill the room. "Where are you?" "What are you wearing?" His tone was calm, never cruel, but it reminded her that freedom was something he could take back at any time. He had other women. She knew it. Everyone did. They appeared in tabloids, in hotel lobbies, in the whispers of staff who thought she couldn't hear. He didn't hide it, and that was the worst part, because not hiding it meant he didn't fear losing her. He believed she'd never leave. And for a long time, he was right. She stopped arguing, stopped crying, stopped trying to be loved. Her rebellion became smaller, quieter. She began writing again, just small lines hidden in a notebook between her dresses. Not poems, not stories, just fragments of truth she wasn't allowed to say out loud. Today he ignored me. Today I smiled and meant none of it. Today I still exist. Writing was the only place she didn't need permission. Sometimes she'd sit on the balcony and imagine the life she might have had. A small apartment, her own job, a dinner table where laughter wasn't an obligation, a man who didn't see her as something to win. The fantasies were brief, always interrupted by reality. A guard clearing his throat, or Karim's shadow appearing in the doorway. He had a way of entering a room that made the air heavier. He'd compliment her softly, then correct her gently. "Your tone," he'd say, "it's too cold. You sound ungrateful." Or, "Don't frown when I talk. It makes you look unhappy." She wanted to tell him that she was unhappy, but she didn't, because she'd learned what came after honesty. So she smiled. She smiled at him, at cameras, at friends she no longer trusted. A smile that became her armor, polished, polite, perfect. No one noticed the cracks beneath it. One evening, after yet another event where she stood beside him like a statue, he watched her from across the room. When they returned home, he poured 2 glasses of wine and said, "You're beautiful when you're quiet." Layla smiled faintly. "Then I must be perfect to you," she said. He laughed, but not kindly. "Exactly." That night, when the house went still, she opened her journal and wrote one line: "I am disappearing beautifully." It was both confession and prophecy. Weeks later, Kareem left again for business. Layla sat on the edge of their bed, hands clasped, heart steady. Something inside her whispered that survival wasn't the same as living. She didn't know what freedom looked like yet, but she could feel it, like a faint breeze under a locked door. She wasn't ready to walk out, not yet. But for the first time, she wanted to. And that quiet wanting, that small, defiant wish, was how her escape truly began. Because sometimes a prison doesn't fall apart all at once. Sometimes it cracks first in silence, and behind every perfect photograph there's a woman who stopped pretending she's happy, long before anyone noticed. For the first time in years, Layla saw her name on a travel document without anyone else's signature beside it. It wasn't freedom, but it was the closest thing to it she'd felt since her wedding day. Kareem had invited her on a business trip to Texas. His company was negotiating a new partnership there. Something about real estate and offshore investments. He said it would be good for her to see how business really worked. She didn't argue. It was a chance to leave Dubai, to breathe air that wasn't monitored or approved. The first few days were a blur of dinners, meetings, and photos with people she didn't know. She smiled when she was told to, said thank you when cameras turned her way. But when Kareem flew back early for urgent meetings, he left her behind to finalize small details. For the first time, there were no guards at the door, no drivers asking where she was going, no one checking her phone. She spent the next morning walking through the city alone. She bought coffee, paid with cash, wandered through a park. It felt strange, not to be looked at, not to be expected to perform. She sat on a bench for almost an hour, just listening to people talk around her. Ordinary voices, ordinary laughter. That's where she first heard the sound of music. A man sitting near the fountain was playing guitar, quietly, just for himself. When she looked over, he smiled. Not the kind of smile she was used to, not practiced, not measured, just warm. His name was Marcus Cole, a music teacher, 26, lived nearby. He offered to show her the best local food spots, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she said yes. That evening, they walked along the river. He asked about Dubai, about her life there. She told him pieces, the parts that sounded safe to share. He listened without interrupting. When she laughed, it startled her. The sound felt new. Over the next few weeks, they saw each other often. Lunches, walks, late-night talks about everything and nothing. For a while, Layla felt human again. She started writing, cooking, even humming songs Marcus taught her. But peace in her world was never meant to last. One night, as they were leaving a cafe, her phone lit up. Unknown number. No message. Then another. And another. Marcus joked that she had a secret admirer. She forced a smile, but inside, her stomach turned cold. The next day, her phone buzzed again. A single text. "I hope you're enjoying your vacation." No name, no signature, but she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was. Kareem. From that moment, the air around her changed. Every car that slowed near the house felt suspicious. Every sound outside made her flinch. Freedom had lasted less than a month. She didn't tell Marcus right away. She tried to pretend it was nothing, that maybe she was imagining it. But deep down, she knew. When a man like Kareem says he loves you, what he really means is, you belong to me. Texas was supposed to be temporary, a few quiet weeks before returning to the same life she had been forced into. But life has a strange way of showing you what you've been missing, often when it's too late to keep it. For Layla, it began with a simple sound. A guitar, somewhere near the water, played by a stranger who wasn't trying to impress anyone. His name was Marcus Cole, a local music teacher. He was younger than her, easygoing, and seemed to carry the kind of peace she had never known. Their paths crossed more than once until it no longer felt like coincidence. At first it was small talk, weather, travel, the kind of polite distance strangers keep. But over time she found herself returning to the same cafe, hoping to see him again. Marcus lived an ordinary life, modest apartment, routine job, a few close friends. He wasn't chasing power or image. He simply existed. And for a woman who had spent her entire life being managed, monitored, and molded, that kind of simplicity felt almost unreal. She never told him who she really was, or the kind of marriage she was escaping. She used her middle name and said she was visiting for business. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he could sense that her quiet carried a history. Over the weeks, Layla began to breathe again. She went on walks, shopped for herself, and started cooking for fun. Small things, but each one felt like an act of defiance against the life she'd left behind. The walls that had always felt so close started to disappear, replaced by open air and ordinary laughter. It wasn't love at first, it was relief. Slow, healing, cautious relief. For a short time, she lived like someone free. She began writing again, journaling her days the way she used to when she was younger. Her notes weren't about pain or fear. They were about color, sound, and light, things she'd forgotten how to notice. But freedom in Layla's life was never permanent. One night, she returned to her rental apartment and noticed her phone lighting up with messages from an unknown number. At first, they were blank, then a single sentence appeared. "I hope you're enjoying your vacation." No name, no context. But she didn't need either. She knew exactly who it was. From that moment, everything shifted. The air felt heavier. Every knock on the door made her chest tighten. She started checking locks twice, sometimes 3 times. When she walked outside, she looked for reflections in glass, scanning cars and faces, convinced someone was watching. Her husband, Kareem, had found her, and if he had found her once, he could find her again. Still, Layla tried to hold on to the normal rhythm she'd built. She went out during the day, stayed in at night, answered no unknown calls. But anxiety doesn't leave quietly. It eats away slowly, one sleepless night at a time. Her health began to slip. She lost weight. She barely spoke on the phone with anyone except Marcus, and even those conversations grew shorter. He noticed her silence, but she told him she was fine. She wasn't. Soon she began receiving calls from numbers registered overseas. When she picked up, there would be nothing but silence, and then the faint click of someone hanging up. It was psychological warfare, the kind of control Kareem specialized in. He didn't need to touch her to remind her who still held power. Despite the fear, she couldn't bring herself to leave again. Running had only ever delayed the inevitable. What she wanted this time was proof, something that would make her story undeniable if he ever came for her. She began collecting evidence quietly: emails, photos, copies of messages she had saved from the past. She created a folder on her computer labeled charity work, hidden inside layers of unrelated documents. Inside were images of bruises, recordings of late-night threats, and notes she had written after every argument she remembered. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. Over time, Marcus became the only person she trusted. She didn't tell him everything, but she told him enough. Enough for him to understand why she jumped at shadows, and why some nights she cried without a clear reason. He stayed by her side through it all, never demanding more than she could give. In her journal, she described him as the calm before the noise. But even calm has an ending. A few weeks later, she started noticing a black SUV parked near the street corner outside her building. Sometimes it was there in the morning, sometimes late at night. Always empty, engine cold, windows tinted. At first, she told herself it was a neighbor's car, but deep down, she knew better. Kareem was close, maybe not in person, but his presence was there, lingering, patient, inevitable. She began to dream of him again, standing in doorways, smiling that same practiced smile. When she woke up, her heart would be racing, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She knew what came next. It was always the same pattern: a warning, a disappearance, a punishment, and yet something inside her refused to break this time. Fear was no longer the only emotion she felt. There was anger, too. A quiet, growing anger that had been waiting years for air. Instead of running, Layla began planning. If Kareem ever found her again, she wanted the truth to outlive her. She backed up every piece of evidence she had to cloud storage. She wrote letters, sealed them in envelopes addressed to her sister and to a friend who still worked in Dubai. She even left a copy of her passport and wedding certificate in a safe deposit box under a fake name. In her final journal entry from that month, she wrote one sentence that stood out: "If he comes again, I'll make sure the world knows what he really is." For weeks afterward, things stayed quiet. No more calls, no more messages. The SUV stopped appearing. Layla allowed herself to believe that maybe, somehow, he'd moved on. Maybe she had finally slipped away from the shadow. But she hadn't. Kareem was already planning his next move, one she could never have prepared for. Freedom ended the same way it began. Quietly. For a few weeks, Layla believed she had slipped beyond his reach. She moved through Texas streets as if learning to walk again. She breathed air that belonged to no one. She told herself that distance could become protection. She didn't yet understand that a man like Kareem Hassan didn't lose what he thought he owned. He simply waited for it to wander back within his grasp. It started with the small things: a wrong number that wasn't wrong, a car idling too long near her apartment, messages from strange accounts that disappeared before she could reply. At first, she told herself it was nothing, the paranoia left over from a life of control. But fear is an instinct that never really forgets. The more she tried to ignore it, the closer it crept. When the knock finally came, it wasn't loud. It was soft, polite, practiced. Two men stood in her doorway, dressed like professionals, calm faces, no threats. They said her husband wanted to see her. They didn't need to raise their voices. Power can whisper and still be obeyed. Within hours, she was on a flight back to Dubai, no questions asked. Money moves faster than any law. People would later ask why she didn't scream in the airport, why she didn't run. The answer is simple. She already knew what happened to people who made scenes in Kareem's world. Guards don't drag you across terminals in handcuffs. They make a single call and the plane doors close. Survival meant silence, and she'd been trained in silence all her life. The return felt like landing inside a photograph. Everything frozen, nothing alive. The house was immaculate, the air heavy with perfume and order. Staff bowed, eyes down. Her mother called once to say she was relieved things were back to normal. Layla realized that, in their world, obedience and safety meant the same thing. Kareem greeted her with that familiar smile, the public one, the one people trusted. He told her she looked tired, told her she was home, told her she'd been missed. Each word sounded caring until you listened to what wasn't said. He never asked if she was happy to return. He didn't need to. He assumed she understood the privilege of being possessed by someone powerful. He reinstated her old schedule: breakfast served at 9, charity correspondence at noon, quiet evenings waiting for him to come home. Her phone was replaced with a new one, registered under his company. Her emails were monitored again. The guards at the gate changed weekly, so none of them could grow familiar. It was control disguised as protection. Layla moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life. She learned to measure time by the click of the surveillance cameras, by the footsteps of the staff outside her door. Every sound reminded her that privacy was an illusion. When she spoke, her words were weighed. When she laughed, it felt like borrowing someone else's voice. Some nights, Kareem didn't come home. When he did, he was gentle in public and cold in private. He never shouted anymore. He didn't need to. Silence became his sharpest weapon. He'd walk past her without a word, letting dread build on its own. Control works best when the victim starts policing herself. In the beginning, she still believed Marcus might find a way to reach her. She'd wake before dawn, check the corners of her room for messages slipped under the door, scan the servants' faces for a hint of recognition. None came. She began to accept that whatever they'd shared belonged to another life, a short one that had ended quietly on an ordinary day. Grief dulled into habit, but habit can't kill awareness. Under the calm surface, she started to think again, small, private thoughts. She realized that nothing Kareem did erased who she had been in Texas. The memory of that brief freedom lived inside her like an ember. She started writing when she was sure the cameras weren't watching. Single sentences on scraps of paper hidden in the seams of books or tucked behind mirrors. They weren't love notes or confessions, just reminders to herself that she still existed. I am here. This isn't forever. He hasn't won. Words became her proof of life. Days turned into weeks. Kareem traveled often, leaving her in the care of assistants who treated obedience like faith. Whenever he was gone, the air in the house changed, still heavy, but less dangerous. She walked barefoot through the halls, memorizing the sound of her own footsteps. The silence felt different when it belonged to her, even for a moment. Sometimes, when she passed the balcony, she imagined stepping beyond the rails. The thought didn't come from hopelessness, but from a strange kind of curiosity, how it would feel to decide something entirely for herself. She never moved closer to the edge. The thought alone was enough to remind her she still had choices, even if none of them were safe. Kareem's anger came back in waves. When he sensed distance in her, he punished her with presence. He followed her from room to room, asked questions she couldn't answer, smiled too long before leaving. He never needed to strike her again. The fear of what might come was more efficient than any blow. She learned that control isn't maintained through violence. It's maintained through the anticipation of it. Every night he repeated the same words before leaving her room. He said he was protecting her, keeping her safe. The words sounded almost tender until you remembered what he meant by safety: walls, silence, obedience. He believed those things kept her alive. In truth, they were slowly erasing her. And yet, even inside that control, Layla started to build something invisible: resolve. It began as stillness, not the kind he demanded, but the kind she chose. She stopped reacting to his moods. She saved her energy. Every small act of survival became a piece of a plan she hadn't yet named. The more he thought he'd broken her, the more deliberate her calm became. One evening, during another public dinner, Kareem bragged about loyalty to his guests. He called Layla the heart of his home, a perfect wife. The crowd laughed politely. She smiled when expected, her eyes fixed on the glass in her hand. When a young server leaned forward to pour wine, she slipped a folded napkin into the pocket of his apron. Just 5 words written in steady handwriting. "Tell Marcus I'm alive." It was reckless, maybe even useless, but it was hers. That single act felt bigger than any escape plan. It reminded her she was still capable of reaching beyond him. That night, she didn't write in her hidden journal. She just sat by the mirror, looking at her reflection. For the first time, she saw not the victim of a marriage, but a woman waiting for the right fracture in the system that held her. A woman collecting pieces of herself, one quiet breath at a time. In her mind, she repeated a single truth. He could take her freedom, her name, her choices, but not her will. Not entirely. She didn't know how or when, but she understood something vital. People like Kareem build cages so perfect they forget that keys exist. And keys, in her world, could look like anything. A contact abroad, a sympathetic worker, a single saved file, a small lie whispered at the right moment. Layla knew he believed she was under his control again. That belief was her advantage. The more convinced he became, the easier it would be to move without notice. For now, she would play her part. She would smile when he entered the room. She would thank him for gifts she didn't want. She would pretend to shrink so that he stopped watching so closely. Each performance became armor. Every forced smile another step towards something unseen. From the outside, their marriage looked repaired. The happy wife returned, the scandal resolved. People congratulated Kareem for his patience, for his forgiveness. They called him honorable. None of them saw the woman behind the glass smile, slowly learning the patterns of her cage. In the weeks ahead, she would use those patterns. She would memorize schedules, names, passwords whispered carelessly during late-night calls. She would collect fragments that seemed harmless to everyone else, but would one day fit together as evidence. For now, she waited. She breathed. She existed. Waiting can be a weapon when the other person believes you've surrendered. Kareem thought he'd dragged her back. He thought she was broken again, small enough to fit the shape he made for her. But what he brought home wasn't the same woman who left. What he brought home was quiet defiance, clothed in obedience. And inside that silence, a plan was forming, slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. For months, Layla lived like a ghost inside her own life. The house was large enough to swallow her thoughts, and the silence was constant. Kareem still moved through rooms like he owned the air itself, but his attention had changed shape. It wasn't passion anymore, it was surveillance. Every glance, every word, every small kindness from a servant became something he wanted to control. She had learned that fear could be quiet. It didn't always shout or bruise. Sometimes it just waited at the edge of every breath. When he took her back to Dubai, she thought her story had ended. The world saw a wife returning home, a family reunited, a husband forgiving a mistake. No one saw the exhaustion behind her eyes. No one heard the way she measured her steps, always careful not to trigger another outburst. She did what she was told, spoke when expected. Smiled for cameras. Her life looked flawless again, but the image felt hollow. Inside, something was shifting, slowly, deliberately. She had begun to see obedience for what it was, a survival skill, not a virtue. The days blended into one another. She noticed how the guards rotated shifts, how the cameras in the hallway flickered for a few seconds before resetting, how Kareem's temper rose and fell with his business deals. She began collecting details the way a drowning person counts seconds between waves. Each one was a possibility, a small hole in the net around her. She knew she couldn't outfight him, but she could outweight him. That was her secret weapon. Patience. The kind that grows sharper the longer it's ignored. At first, she didn't think of escape. She thought of air. Just air. A moment outside where no one was watching. Freedom didn't start as a plan. It started as a craving. She wanted to breathe without permission, to exist without being corrected. That hunger made her alert. Every locked door became a puzzle, every conversation a map. Control had trained her to observe, and now she was using it against the man who taught her fear. Kareem liked grand gestures. When he entertained guests, he demanded perfection, music, lights, the right people laughing at the right time. During those nights, the staff's attention shifted. Guards drank more coffee, maids whispered. No one looked twice at the woman moving quietly through corridors. Those were her windows of opportunity. She learned the rhythm of his ego, how it blinded him at the exact moments she needed him distracted. Power, she realized, carries its own blind spots. She started with small acts that meant nothing to anyone else. She memorized numbers from business cards she found on his desk. She learned which drawers were never checked. She found the only exit without a camera pointed at it. Each discovery felt dangerous but also thrilling, like rediscovering the idea of herself. She wasn't ready yet. She just wanted to know that escape was possible. That belief alone kept her sane. But even patience runs out. One afternoon, after another argument that ended in the same cold silence, she looked around her gilded cage and saw it clearly for the first time. The house wasn't a fortress. It was a stage. Everything inside existed to prove that Kareem was in control. If she left quietly, he'd never see it coming. She didn't want revenge, not yet. She wanted distance wide enough to think again. For weeks, she prepared without leaving evidence. She traded a necklace for a favor from a driver who owed her father a debt. She slipped written notes into laundry bags, each one a message moving slowly outward through the web of people still loyal to her. She relied on whispers, on kindness from those who remembered who she used to be. The plan took shape one piece at a time: transportation, documents, a place to hide once she crossed the border. She never allowed herself to picture the ending. Hope was too dangerous to imagine. It made her careless. The night she finally acted, there was no drama. No running, no shouting, no suspense. It was quiet, almost eerily calm. A party echoed through the courtyard, music spilling across the marble floors. Kareem's laughter carried over the sound of glass clinking. Everyone was looking at him. And for once, he wasn't looking at her. She walked out of the side door, steady and composed, wearing the same expression she always wore. To anyone watching, it looked like she belonged exactly where she was going. The car waited near the service gate, engine low. The driver didn't speak. They both understood that words could ruin everything. As the gates opened, she stared at the guards. Her pulse didn't quicken, her hands didn't tremble. She had already lived through worse than being caught. The world outside felt unreal, like a dream repeating itself. And then the city lights began to fade behind them, replaced by dark roads and endless desert. Hours later, the sun rose over another country. For the first time in years, she saw it without tinted windows. That was the moment she realized she had truly left. She didn't cry. Freedom didn't feel like celebration. It felt like exhaustion. Every part of her body was shaking, not from fear, but from disbelief that she'd actually done it. Reaching Texas wasn't simple. Paperwork, visas, flights arranged through favors she'd never be able to repay. The journey was a blur of airports and false names, each one a risk that could have ended everything. But she made it. And when she finally stepped into the same city where her brief happiness had once lived, the air felt different. It carried both promise and memory, the two things she'd been denied for so long. Seeing Marcus again didn't feel like a reunion from movies. It was quieter, more fragile. They were both older, worn by distance and fear. But there was something steady in his presence, something that reminded her she wasn't invisible anymore. He didn't ask for details at first. He just listened, letting her story unfold at her own pace. In those moments, she rediscovered the power of being believed. For someone who had lived years under suspicion, that kind of belief was healing. Yet freedom brought a new kind of terror. She kept checking the window, scanning crowds, jumping at unknown numbers on her phone. Trauma, she learned, doesn't end when you cross a border. It follows silently, whispering possibilities of danger even when you're safe. She understood that Kareem's reach was long. Money travels faster than people. But she refused to live in hiding forever. Fear had stolen enough time already. She began to write again, not in secret now, but with purpose. Every detail she remembered, every bruise, every document she'd seen, she wrote down. Each memory became a piece of evidence. She wasn't gathering them for revenge, she was gathering them for closure. It was the only way to make sense of what she'd survived. Marcus helped her organize what she found, helped her see patterns she hadn't noticed, the financial accounts, the names, the connections that tied power to silence. It was risky, but necessary. For Layla, documentation was liberation. Every page she filled was a step further from the version of herself that Kareem had built. At night, she'd sit on the floor beside her bed, laptop open, the glow painting her face in pale light. The sound of typing replaced the sound of his voice. Each keystroke said the same thing. I exist, and I will not disappear again. There were moments when guilt crept in. She thought of her family, of the life she'd destroyed by defying them. In her culture, defiance carried weight heavier than love. But she'd spent too many years living for everyone else's comfort. The cost of obedience had been her identity, and she refused to pay it again. People imagine escape as a sprint, a burst of adrenaline, a sudden freedom. It isn't. It's slow. It's uncertain. It's a series of small choices made while pretending you're not making them. It's learning to walk away without leaving footprints. Layla knew this now. She had traded a golden prison for a fragile kind of peace, and that was enough. Even in Texas, even surrounded by quiet, she didn't kid herself. Kareem would look for her. He always needed to win, but she had something now that he could never control, a truth that lived outside his reach. That truth was power. And for the first time, she felt what real strength sounded like. It wasn't anger, it was calm. Escape wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of her revenge, though she never used that word. What she wanted was not to destroy him, but to live in a world where his power meant nothing. And for a woman who'd been treated as a possession, that was the ultimate rebellion. She would never go back, not because she was brave, but because she had finally remembered who she was before fear. The journey had stripped her of everything, status, security, innocence, but it had given her back herself. And that was something Kareem couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, and couldn't erase. By the time the first week passed, she no longer jumped at every sound. She started opening the blinds in the morning. She started walking outside without looking over her shoulder. The world hadn't changed, but she had. The sun felt warmer, the air tasted like choice. In her journal, she wrote a single line, one that summed up everything she'd learned. Freedom doesn't start when you run. It starts the moment you decide you're done being afraid. For Layla, fear had become something familiar. It didn't arrive with noise anymore. It just lived quietly in the corner of every room, waiting. By now, she understood it. She had learned its patterns, its language, the way it never truly left. But this time, she wasn't running from it. She was learning to use it. By the time she returned to Texas, she knew the only way to stay alive was to stop being silent. Freedom wasn't about distance. It was about truth, the kind that can't be erased, even by power. She began piecing her life together like a puzzle made from memories she'd tried to forget. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing, not friends, not neighbors, not even the small community that had started to accept her. Every move had to stay quiet. Every step had to look normal. During the day, she moved like any other woman rebuilding her life. But at night, she turned her apartment into an evidence room. She searched old phones for messages she once deleted out of fear. She found them, short, threatening sentences, reminders of control dressed up as concern. She printed photos she'd hidden in drafts of old emails, pictures of her face, of bruises fading, of dresses torn at the sleeve. Proof that her pain had once existed, even if everyone around her had chosen to pretend it didn't. It was exhausting work. Reliving years she had tried so hard to bury. Each piece of evidence was like reopening a wound. But she pushed through the exhaustion. Pain, at least, meant she was doing something that mattered. Over time, the pieces started forming a shape, something bigger than she expected. What she found wasn't just cruelty, it was business. Transactions that led to shell companies, companies that funded quiet disappearances, and money that moved too cleanly, to be honest. The abuse she suffered was only one part of a much larger story, a pattern that didn't stop with her. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. Kareem's empire was built not only on wealth, but on silence. He didn't just buy property, he bought people's obedience. And Layla was done being bought. Still, collecting evidence meant living with a constant tremor of fear. Every time she opened a file, she imagined his voice behind her. Every click of her keyboard sounded too loud. The walls of her apartment felt thinner each night. She worked with methodical care, storing duplicates on encrypted drives, saving backups in hidden folders, uploading copies to cloud storage. She didn't trust technology, but she trusted her instincts. They had kept her alive this long. Outside, the world looked calm. Inside, she was in the middle of a quiet war. She started keeping a written record again, notes about where files were stored, who she had contacted, and what she had found. Her handwriting had changed since Dubai. It was sharper now, as if even her letters had stopped pretending to be gentle. Weeks passed like that, uneventful on the surface, dangerous underneath. Every night she told herself the same thing, just one more day, just one more file. And yet, underneath the determination, there was exhaustion, the kind that sits deep in the body. She hadn't slept properly in months. Each sound outside her window made her tense. Each shadow felt like a memory she couldn't shake. Sometimes she thought about how strange survival felt. It wasn't heroic. It was lonely. She wasn't living boldly. She was living carefully, every heartbeat a negotiation between courage and caution. Still, she kept going. Through her contacts back home, she received financial documents, evidence of Kareem's network, his illegal transfers, and his hidden accounts. The numbers meant nothing to most people, but to her, they were power. They were the receipts of his control, and now they were hers. She gathered photographs of women who had worked for him, maids, assistants, secretaries. Faces blurred by fear, but stories that all sounded the same. Promises, control, silence. Each file she opened confirmed what she already knew. She was never his first victim, and she wouldn't have been the last. The process changed her. There was no longer any version of herself that wanted forgiveness. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had turned into something sharper. Focus. She no longer needed permission to exist. Days began blending into nights. The stack of printed pages grew taller, the folder on her computer heavier. She could feel it. Every secret she uncovered was one more step toward freedom, but also one more reason for him to find her. It was a strange kind of balance, building justice with one hand while holding fear with the other. Sometimes she would stop, stare at everything she had collected, and wonder if it would ever be enough. Could words on a page really undo what he'd done? Could a file erase the years he'd taken? But then she would remind herself, this wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making sure he couldn't rewrite it. Her apartment became quiet proof of that determination. Labeled envelopes, drives sealed in plastic, copies hidden in places only she knew. There was no more room for doubt. There was only purpose. And yet, even purpose couldn't hide the weight of fear. The closer she got to exposing him, the more she felt him closing in. There were small signs at first, a call that rang once before cutting off. A car parked outside for hours that never seemed to leave. The sudden appearance of spam emails sent from addresses that looked familiar. Layla had seen this pattern before. It was how he started, testing the air, reminding her that his reach didn't end with geography. She began to feel the same cold awareness she'd felt in Dubai. Not the panic of being caught, but the dread of being watched. Still, she didn't stop. Every night she uploaded her findings to a hidden online folder. She added timestamps, labels, and cross-references. Everything had to be traceable. Everything had to outlive her. She stopped thinking about winning. She only thought about finishing. The plan was simple. Once she had enough, she would take everything to the authorities. There would be press coverage, legal pressure, exposure. It wouldn't undo what happened, but it could stop it from happening again. That was the only outcome she cared about now. But what Layla didn't realize was that while she was collecting evidence against Kareem, someone else was collecting information about her. Someone had noticed the unusual data transfers, the hidden messages, the late-night uploads. And somewhere, far from Texas, a man who never accepted defeat had begun to pay attention again. Layla didn't know it yet, but her quiet mission had turned into a signal. In her mind, she was building a shield. In his world, she was drawing a target. And on the night she believed she had finally gathered enough, when the folder was complete, the files backed up, the truth fully documented, she felt something strange. Relief. For the first time in years, she felt almost safe. She didn't understand that safety was the final illusion. The calm before someone who refuses to lose decides to play his last move. It was the night before everything was supposed to change. After months of fear, hiding, and second-guessing every sound outside their window, Layla and Marcus had finally reached the moment they'd been working toward, the day they could stop running. The plan was simple. Tomorrow, they'd take everything they had to the police. It didn't look like much what they'd gathered. Just a few files, a flash drive, and a notebook filled with details that only made sense if you knew the story behind them. But to Layla, it was more than evidence. It was her freedom condensed into something she could hold in her hands. The proof that her life hadn't been a series of mistakes. The proof that she had been telling the truth all along. For the first time in years, there was hope. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, gentle, almost shy. The kind of hope that comes after too much pain. Cautious, like it knows how fragile it is. Layla moved slowly that evening, aware of every sound in the small apartment. She folded clothes that she'd already packed twice before. She checked the locks even though she knew they were secure. Every little thing felt heavy with meaning, her passport on the counter, the half-finished cup of tea, the notebook open on the bed. These were the final hours of a life she was ready to leave behind. Marcus had spent most of the day organizing the files, making sure every document was backed up in 3 different places. Layla had learned that in cases like hers, proof mattered more than pain. Feelings could be doubted, evidence could not. That flash drive was her voice when she wasn't allowed to speak. They'd agreed that they wouldn't talk about what came next until it was over. There was no point in imagining freedom before it was real. So they spent the evening doing small, normal things, things that felt like a rehearsal for the life they wanted. They made dinner, played soft music, talked about the weather. It was almost ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own kind of miracle. But Layla couldn't fully shake the unease. She had felt this quiet before, the calm that always came before Kareem struck back. It was a silence that carried a pulse, the kind that hums beneath the surface like static. You can't see it, but you can feel it in your bones. She tried not to think about him, but he was there, always in the back of her mind. The kind of man who didn't just lose, he hunted what he lost. And deep down, she knew he would never accept the idea that she'd escaped his control. Men like Kareem didn't let go. They simply waited for the right moment to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Still, she told herself he didn't know. She'd been careful. New phone, new address, no photos, no names. She'd learned to erase her digital footprints the way someone erases fingerprints from glass. But control gives birth to paranoia, and she'd lived under his control long enough to know what it felt like when the walls started to close in again. Marcus had tried to reassure her, and she appreciated it. But trust is hard to rebuild once it's been broken over and over again. Even safety can start to feel temporary. So she prepared for both possibilities, the freedom she wanted and the danger she expected. She wrote one last note in her journal that night. It wasn't a letter or a confession. It was more like a declaration to herself. She wrote that if anything happened, it would happen on her terms this time, that she wasn't running anymore, that she had told her story, and that the truth was already out there in some form, waiting to be found. She didn't know that somewhere across the ocean, Kareem was already moving. A contact from his circle had informed him of a breach. Someone in his network had discovered activity tied to Layla's old accounts, file transfers, unfamiliar IP addresses. To anyone else, it would have looked like digital noise, but to Kareem, it was enough. He didn't wait for confirmation. Men like him never did. He acted. He was on a plane within hours, under a different name, traveling the same route he'd once used for business. On paper, it was just another trip. In truth, it was a mission to correct what he called an insult. Layla had no idea. She was still in that small bubble of temporary peace, feeling for once almost like a normal person. The weight she'd carried for years was starting to lift, little by little. Even her breathing had changed, slower, deeper, like her body finally remembered what safety felt like. That night, she stayed awake later than usual. The plan was to rest, to be ready for the long day ahead, but sleep didn't come easily. Freedom has its own kind of fear. When you've lived too long in control, even happiness feels suspicious. She walked around the apartment, touching things absent-mindedly. Books, the curtain, her passport. She stared at the flash drive sitting on the table. It looked ordinary, almost fragile. But inside it was everything that could destroy the man who had destroyed her. She whispered to herself that this was the last night she'd ever have to think about him again. But the truth is, she wasn't free yet. Every survivor knows this feeling, the one that tells you something is about to happen, even if there's no proof. The air gets heavier, the night feels longer, the silence grows teeth. That was the space Layla was in. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, her heart wouldn't stop racing. At some point after midnight, she checked her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. Just a blank screen reflecting her face. For the first time in a long while, she didn't look afraid. She looked determined. That reflection would be the last image anyone had of her alive. Later, investigators would find the phone still on the table, its screen dimmed, a half-written note unsent. It said only this: "If I don't make it to tomorrow, tell them I tried." But on that night, her final night, Layla didn't know how close he already was. She didn't know he'd been watching, following her digital shadow across continents. She didn't know he'd landed in Texas just hours before, hidden behind a name he didn't deserve. All she knew was that she had finally gathered the courage to confront the man who stole her life, and for a few hours she believed she'd already won. The air inside that apartment was filled with quiet hope, the kind that feels too delicate to last, the kind that always breaks when the past refuses to stay buried. She folded her notebook, placed it beside the evidence drive, and sat down. There was nothing left to plan. Nothing left to fear. At least that's what she told herself. Outside, the night moved like it always does, calm, ordinary, unaware of the storm walking toward her. Somewhere across town, a man stepped out of a black car and adjusted his cufflinks, calm as if he were arriving at a meeting. By dawn, the apartment would be silent. By noon, detectives would walk in and call it a tragedy. And by evening, the world would start asking questions about who she really was and why someone like her had to die to be heard. But that was all still ahead. For now, it was just the night before, the last calm moment in a story that would end in whispers and evidence, in truth and blood. Layla had fought to exist in her own story. She just never knew it would end with her finally being believed. The night before, everything ended, was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in that eerie way that makes silence feel like a warning. The kind of quiet that presses on your chest and tells you something's wrong before you know what it is. Inside the small Airbnb, Layla and Marcus had done everything they could. The plan was simple: go to the police in the morning, hand over the evidence, and finally stop running. They had spent weeks gathering it: proof of Kareem's abuse, financial records, names of offshore accounts, recordings, photos, all neatly labeled and backed up. It wasn't just paperwork, it was their last chance to make the truth louder than his money. They should have felt relief. After all the fear, this was supposed to be the turning point, the night before freedom. But when people have lived in danger long enough, their bodies stop believing in calm. Even when everything looks safe, something inside keeps waiting for the sound of footsteps. That's what this night was. Waiting. Layla couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed every moment she'd tried to forget. The first slap, the first time she lied to her parents, the first night she realized the man she married didn't love her. He owned her. Now, after everything, she was inches from justice. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd never make it to morning. Marcus paced the room quietly, packing and repacking the evidence. The documents, the drive, her phone, all ready to go. He was the practical one, always trying to believe in plans. But even he couldn't stop glancing at the window every few minutes, as if expecting headlights to appear. It was a still night in Austin. The air felt heavy, thick with humidity and tension. Outside, The streetlights buzzed faintly. Inside, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the clock ticking in the kitchen. The sound seemed louder than usual, marking every second that wouldn't stop. Layla kept checking her phone. She'd already backed up everything online, sent copies to a hidden account under a new name. She thought she'd covered every angle. But she also knew who she was dealing with. Kareem had money, contacts, and an obsession that didn't end just because she ran. He was the kind of man who believed no one could ever really leave him. When you've lived under control for years, you start to understand how it thinks, how it breathes. Kareem didn't react out of emotion. He calculated. He'd waited before. He'd let her feel safe just long enough to prove that safety was an illusion. That's what made this night feel different. It wasn't fear of the unknown. It was recognition. She'd felt this silence before, right before the damage began. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the folder on the table. Everything they had, every secret, every bruise, every number that could destroy him, was inside. And somewhere deep down, she knew that if he ever found out, he wouldn't hesitate. He never did. The air conditioning kicked on, a small, normal sound, but even that made her flinch. She didn't say anything, but Marcus saw it. They were both exhausted. They'd been living on adrenaline, surviving on the idea that truth was enough to save them. But truth alone is fragile when the man you're running from thinks he's untouchable. It was around midnight when the unease turned into certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from logic, it comes from instinct. Layla looked toward the front door, and for a reason she couldn't explain, her stomach dropped. Some people say they can feel danger before it arrives. Maybe it's something primal, an old survival sense that never fades. She felt it then, a shift in the air, a weight pressing in. Outside, a car engine idled, faint but steady. A black SUV parked just far enough from the streetlight to be invisible at first glance. The driver didn't move. The headlights stayed off. The neighborhood slept on, unaware that two people inside that house had already run out of time. Layla stood up and tried to breathe evenly. It didn't help. Every second stretched longer. The house seemed to shrink around her, walls closing in, shadows moving, even when they weren't. She thought about all the things she'd never said to her family, all the times she'd tried to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect silence. For a moment, she hated how much pretending she'd done just to keep everyone comfortable. She went to the table, touched the folder of evidence, and felt something close to peace. It wasn't much, but it was something. At least the truth existed now. Even if she didn't survive, there was proof of what had been done to her. That thought kept her steady when her hands started to shake. The night dragged on. Every sound was a question. Every creak in the walls, every faint echo from outside carried the same message. It's time. Then, just before 1 a.m, the stillness broke. The door handle shifted once, softly, like someone testing it. The sound was small, but final. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was methodical. Whoever entered moved with purpose, no hesitation. There were no shouts, no arguments, no warnings, just footsteps. Calm, measured, terrifying in their control. Neighbors later said they didn't hear anything unusual. They were used to quiet nights. By the time dawn broke, the house looked untouched. The beds made, dishes clean, lights off. 2 lives erased so neatly it didn't look like violence. It looked like absence. The police were called around 8 a.m. A cleaning service found the bodies. They said the room smelled faintly of perfume and bleach. What struck investigators first wasn't the crime itself, but how deliberate it looked. Whoever did it knew where to go, what to take, what to destroy. Phones were broken, cameras disabled, drives missing. There was no sign of struggle, but what Kareem didn't understand was that technology doesn't always obey control. Layla's phone, smashed and lifeless on the floor, had already uploaded its last sync hours before. Every photo, Every message, every file she'd backed up had survived him. Her voice, recorded weeks earlier, steady and careful, was still there, quietly waiting in the cloud. The evidence he thought he'd buried was already beyond his reach. Kareem boarded his private jet before sunrise, left the country before anyone connected the dots. Within days, he was back in Dubai, smiling for photographs at another charity event, shaking hands, posing for headlines. His image never cracked, but for those who found Layla, the truth was clear. There was no forced entry, no theft, nothing random. This wasn't a robbery or a lover's quarrel. This was a message, a man reclaiming ownership of something that was never his to begin with. And yet, in the smallest way, she'd won. Because what he couldn't destroy was the one thing he feared most, the truth told by her own hand. As investigators began to piece it together, the silence that had once protected him began to turn against him. Every photo recovered, every log entry, every trace from her phone became her final testimony. Layla's last night wasn't just tragedy. It was evidence. Her story, even in death, refused to stay buried. And while the world carried on, news cycles spinning, cameras flashing, Kareem smiling in expensive suits, the truth had already begun to whisper its way out. The night in that room was supposed to be the end of her voice. Instead, it became the beginning of his downfall. For almost a month after the killings, the world moved on. The case of Layla Al-Hassan and Marcus Cole slipped down news feeds and out of conversations. Two people found dead in a rented house. Tragic, yes, but not unusual enough to hold attention in a world addicted to fresh tragedy. The official statement called it an unresolved homicide under active investigation. Behind those few words sat a silence thick with power, money, and influence. Layla's family said little. Kareem Hassan, still in Dubai, appeared at charity events and board meetings as if nothing had happened. He smiled for photographs, told reporters he was deeply saddened by recent rumors, and donated to a women's foundation for good measure. It was the same strategy that had worked for him his entire life. Drown the truth in good publicity, and people stop asking questions. But truth is stubborn. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, sometimes it hides inside a phone backup no one thinks to check. The discovery began with a young technician at the Austin Police Department. She'd been told to archive digital evidence from the Airbnb where Layla and Marcus were found. Most of the devices were damaged, screens shattered, drives erased, data wiped clean. But one phone, Layla's, still contained a faint trace of life in its cloud sync. The technician spent nights off the clock trying to rebuild it, line by line, file by file. On the third night, the fragments began to form a story. There were photographs first, bruises on her arms, hotel receipts, screenshots of threatening messages. Then audio files, short and shaky, each labeled by date. And finally, a longer recording, the last one, time-stamped the night she died. When the technician pressed play, she expected static. Instead, she heard breathing. Then Layla's voice, calm, measured, almost peaceful, the way people sound when they've already accepted the ending. She spoke of fear, of love, of a man who couldn't stand being disobeyed. Her tone wasn't panicked, it was factual, as if she were leaving instructions for whoever might listen later. The words weren't for drama, they were for evidence. Then there was a sound, a knock, a pause, footsteps, and the recording stopped. That single file changed everything. Investigators reopened the case with a new lens. Forensic accountants traced private jet logs and offshore transfers that linked Kareem directly to the trip to Texas. Security footage from a Houston hangar showed his jet arriving under an alias. Phone records connected him to a prepaid number that pinged towers near the Airbnb that same night. Each discovery was another crack in the story he'd sold to the world. When international warrants were issued, Kareem was still untouchable in his mind. He was planning a new wedding, another young bride, another merger between families, another chance to parade power as love. He'd ordered a ring worth more than most homes and reserved an entire hotel floor for the ceremony. The morning of that celebration, Police and Interpol agents walked through the lobby, straight past reporters waiting for photos. They found him smiling in a white suit, holding champagne. For a moment he looked confused, as if the laws that governed other men shouldn't apply to him. Then realization settled in, the slow, quiet kind that doesn't scream, it just collapses. News of the arrest exploded online. Headlines called it the Sheikh's fall. Television panels debated whether it was love gone wrong or power unchecked. But beneath the noise, what people really reacted to wasn't his downfall. It was her voice. When parts of Layla's recovered recordings were released in court filings, listeners around the world heard what had been hidden for years. She didn't plead for help. She didn't curse his name. She simply told the truth, the way a teacher explains a lesson. Clear, direct, almost gentle. And in doing so, she dismantled a man who thought fear would always be louder than honesty. That voice became evidence, but it was also testimony. Proof that she never disappeared completely. Every word she left behind pushed the investigation forward. Her files revealed financial crimes, threats, abuse, and a network of people paid to protect his reputation. They also revealed something deeper, the small human details of her final months. Her sketches saved in a folder called Tomorrow, a note that read, "Freedom costs everything, but I'll still pay." And an unsent message addressed to Marcus, "If I make it out, we start over where no one knows our names." The court never heard that message, but the technician who found it did. She said it was the line that made her keep working overtime until every file was restored. When Kareem finally faced trial, he denied everything. He called Layla unstable, called Marcus a manipulator, called the evidence digital fabrication. But the data didn't lie. Every photograph matched timestamps, every transaction aligned, every flight, every message, every threat led straight back to him. In the end, the walls he'd built to protect himself became the proof of what he'd done. The verdict came quietly, almost anticlimactic for something so large. Guilty on multiple counts. Sentencing postponed pending appeals. No camera crews were allowed inside, only the clicking of pens from reporters taking notes. When the judge read the decision, Kareem didn't react. He just stared forward, jaw locked, the same look he'd given her countless times when silence was his weapon. Layla's family sat behind the prosecution, expressionless. They had spent years denying the abuse, and now they faced the cost of their silence. Money could no longer rewrite the ending. Outside, the crowd wasn't cheering. There was no celebration, only quiet relief. People didn't feel triumph. They felt the weight of what it took for the truth to surface. For every woman who had been told to endure it. For every voice that never got recorded. When journalists summarized the case, they focused on the scandal, the luxury, the global attention. But the people who actually listened to Layla's words heard something else. Dignity, not the kind that comes from power, but the kind that survives it. In her recordings, there was no bitterness, just calm, just truth. As if she knew that even if her body didn't make it, her story would. One reporter closed her feature with a line that stayed with viewers long after the video ended. Power silenced her once. Evidence made her eternal. That's what makes this story hard to forget. It doesn't end with revenge. It ends with validation. Justice didn't roar. It whispered in her voice, carried through data, crossing oceans she never had the chance to cross again. People like Kareem rely on noise, money, influence, appearances. People like Layla rely on proof, and proof, once found, doesn't die. Her recordings still exist in the case archives, time-stamped, preserved, and protected. Every so often, a law student or investigator will listen to them for training. Each one hears the same thing. A calm woman explaining her own murder before it happened. And each one, no matter how many cases they've studied, falls silent at the end. Because that's the power of her voice. It doesn't beg for pity. It demands remembrance. In the end, she didn't escape through distance or protection. She escaped through truth, and truth, once spoken clearly enough, becomes impossible to bury. So when the story fades again, as all stories eventually do, somewhere her voice remains. Not screaming, not crying, just steady, still teaching us that freedom isn't safety and silence isn't peace. Her final words echo through every version of this story, no matter who tells it. If I don't make it out, at least the truth will. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. The truth made it out.